Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Section 41. 1. Snow began to fall at dusk, just a week after Christmas, and when, on New Year's morning, Anna came out of her room and along the gallery, the ceiling overhead was as bright as no mere sunshine could make it. With that clear, radiant clearness that the morning light on snow alone can give, the coffered roof 10 feet above her was visible in every detail of its blue and gold. And the floor beneath, with its rugs and its chairs and the great shining piano and the gilded pipes of the organ, resembled a Dutch painting, so minute and perfect and homely it all appeared. She went along the gallery, herself extraordinarily pretty and fair-complexioned in that enchanting light, and tapped softly on the door of the west bedroom. There was no answer, but she was conscious of a vibration from within. Then the door opened softly, and Charleston's face looked out. He nodded emphatically without a word, and stood aside to let her go by. Then he closed the door behind her, and himself went across into the bedroom so as to be within call. The room was as unterrible as a death chamber ever can be. It was not quite that yet, but the end could not be far off. The lad's headaches had begun again midway through November, and the doctor had been there every day onwards. Sir Arthur Hansworth had come down twice from London, but had confessed that there was no more to be done. Morphia had been administered from time to time, when the patient's pain drove him into delirium, but at all other times he had refused it. A week before Christmas stupor had set in, and, it was thought, blindness. He talked a little from time to time, but had seemed to recognize nobody. Last night, however, he had awakened from unconsciousness, and Anna had had half an hour's talk with him. He had then fallen asleep, and an hour later the news had come to her that he still slept. He had told her, before he slept, that his blindness had come back. This morning the daylight on the snow outside brightened the room wonderfully, though he would not be able to see it. The white light lay on the high polished furniture, the frames of the engravings, the folds of the chintz curtains, and above all, on the face of the dying man and the linen round his swathed head. He lay high in bed, his shoulders supported by piles of pillows, and his hands hidden beneath the silk quilt. He had already been shaved and washed, and the folds and sunken hollows in the cheeks were vivid and sharp. His eyes were turned on Anna as she came in, and he smiled as he heard her step. "That's you," he said. His voice was quite distinct and very quiet. It was not horrible in any way. "Yes, my dear," she said, and sat down by his bedside. "Give me a kiss, if you don't mind." She rose again, and kissed him very softly on his forehead, just below the wet bandage. The drug-like smell was very clear to her as she did so. "How long have I got?" he asked, as she sat down again. She did not pretend not to understand. "We must wait till the doctor comes," she said. "You wired for Algie, as I asked you last night?" "He'll be here by 11. An extraordinary steadiness of will had come down on her since her last desperate struggle more than 2 months ago, when she had turned, in the morning room, on the old man and poured out on him the last drops of bitterness that her soul contained. Since that time, when she had learned of her boy's own attitude to death, how he too had his bad times, how he hid them from her, not because he did not love her, but because he loved her enough to trust her as well, Since the moment she had looked out of the window and seen the great Robbia Pietà leaning against the wall of the terrace, and had understood what its erection meant, since then she had had not even a temptation to resentment. It had appeared to her now that it had not been death itself that she had feared for him, but its circumstances, and that as long as she could keep her attention fixed on death itself, its circumstances could not distract nor trouble her. Since that revelation, she simply had not to struggle at all. It seemed that she had been lifted clean out of the realm where resentment is possible, where one soul demands attentions from another, where the small passions rage and fret, and faults are found and grudges cherished. It was like the world, she thought this morning, on which the snow had fallen, a wide, white, shining realm where roughness have ceased to exist, where colors have gone back again, not into the blackness that is their negation, but to the whiteness which is their source and end. The whiteness is deathly cold, but it is not death. It is only silence. Its lights, too, the dark roofs and corners of a house within, though it lies heavy on the house without. She could think, too, broadly and passively now, instead of actively and energetically. She could look back on the past without even a flush of personal feeling, on Enid and her own jealousies, on Neville's disturbing detachment, on the long chain of miseries, her omens, her terrors, her apprehensions, on the growing crescendo of Neville's sickness, his headaches, his sudden blindness, on the horrors of the operation and the drawing room where she had learned the news that he must die, on her dull wretchedness at Hartley again, and her flare of anger in the morning room. She saw these now to be but steps of an initiation of which she had never dreamed, an initiation into a secret of which she had thought that she already held the key. She had been told long ago of how serene she seemed. Neville himself had spoken of it to her when her husband had died. She knew now, in the possession of real serenity, how false the other had been. It had been a trick of temperament, no more than that. But now she could look on this boy's gaunt face against the pillows, at his closed eyes, his wet bandaged head, on the angles of his shoulders so sharp through his nightclothes, without clenching her teeth. She could watch him and talk to him slowly without even desiring to take his hand. She could picture his dying here before her eyes without horror. He lay here, she knew that now, in the room that she once feared so much, in the bed where her father had died before him. He lay here, as certainly a part of the enormous design that unfolded and used both of them, as reconcilable with the vast sacrificial love that was its secrets, as Jim, himself playing with the collies on the lawn. The line between good and evil was not the same as the line between pleasure and pain. It was the line rather between the acceptance and the non-acceptance of destiny. "I don't think there's anything particular to say," said Neville after a pause. He spoke slowly, but quite distinctly, with short silences between his sentences. "No, my dear, I don't think there is. Handsworth said I should get my senses back before I die, didn't he?" "Yes, he said it might be so." "Well, I suppose this is it." "It might be so," she said. Aunt Anna? Yes, my dear. You'd better tell Father Richardson to bring the Vatican while I'm conscious. You'd like him to come at once? Directly after Mass, if he will be so kind. And I want to see Jim after breakfast. It isn't 8 yet? Not quite. You're going to Mass? If you don't want me. I'm all right, said Neville. Charleston was here just now. The nurse had gone down for breakfast, I suppose? I think so. Aunt Anna? Yes, my dear. I do want to say something after all. I want to be sure, you know. You're perfectly happy, aren't you? Yes, she said quite deliberately. I'm perfectly happy. He smiled, still with closed eyes. I knew you were. It was ever since the Pietà was put up, wasn't it? I'm sorry I didn't tell you about it before, but I had to do it my own way, you know. You'll let it stop there, won't you? I told you about Frascati, didn't I? Yes, my dear. Well, it all dates from that, you know. Those are the 2 points. I began to see that after my operation, as soon as I knew I couldn't live, I saw the point then. Everything fits in perfectly, you know. As soon as you see that, Enid and everything else. My dear, you are too tired. No, I'm not. I was just saying it bang out. What an ass I was. I wanted to be a Jesuit first, you know. Then I was angry when I was told I mustn't be. Then I tried Enid instead of God, you know. And then I was routed out of that. And then I tried just being happy alone. Nature. And all that rot, you know. And then I got ill. I see the point now. You do too, don't you? Of course you do. So here we are, back again at the beginning. You do really see it, don't you? Yes, I see it perfectly, said Aunt Anna. 2. Jim went upstairs all alone, very sedate and quiet as soon as he had had breakfast. He looked back from the top of the stairs to see if his mother was still looking up at him from the hall. She was, and she nodded reassuringly. He hastily turned away again. He felt a little ashamed of having needed that reassurance. Then he tapped cautiously on the door of the west bedroom. It had been an agitating morning for Jim. So long as Cousin Neville was really properly ill, nothing much interrupted his life. He had, of course, to go very quietly always along the gallery, and the piano was not to be touched at all. Not even God Save the King with one finger in F was to be rendered upon it. Neither were the collies to be brought indoors at all, on any pretext whatever, for fear that Jill might bark. Otherwise, however, matters proceeded as usual, or, at least, as they did when Cousin Neville was away from home. There had been one rather disconcerting morning when Jim had heard curious sounds issuing from the bedroom door, but he had been commanded to use the back staircase for the rest of that day. In the evening, a baize door arrived in a cart and was taken upstairs, and thenceforward life was normal. He was aware, of course, that Cousin Neville was very ill indeed, but after a week or so, this did not greatly affect his imagination. This morning, however, at breakfast his mother had looked funny, and he would have expressed it, and she presently told him that he was to go and see Cousin Neville and say good-bye to him. Jim had inquired whether Cousin Neville was going to go to Rome again, and his mother had then told him quite plainly once more that Cousin Neville was going to die. Jim's views on death were perfectly formed. He knew exactly what happened. The soul went to heaven after a spell in purgatory, and the body went into the churchyard. He blinked rather rapidly when he heard that this was going to happen to Cousin Neville, and played with his toast. He was not sure whether he wanted to cry or not, but crying was discouraged by his mother, and, in any case, for about 6 weeks he had not seen Cousin Neville at all, and 6 weeks is a vast period. He looked up at his mother presently. "And I shan't see him any more?" he said. "After now, I mean." "Not till you die yourself, my dear." "When shall I die?" "I have no idea at all," said Anna gravely. "But there's something else, too, I want to say. Cousin Neville has been very ill indeed. You know that, don't you? Well, he looks quite different now. He's much thinner, and he's wearing a sort of white cap on his head. You mustn't touch that white cap. It's wet. And you mustn't be frightened, will you?" "No, Mummy," said Jim very softly. "Stop as long as he wants you. And if he doesn't say anything, ask him whether you're to go away. If he doesn't answer, just come away on tiptoe. I shall be in the hall all the time, and Nurse will be in the bathroom. So you won't be afraid, will you?" "No, Mummy." Here then he stood, and his heart hammered in his breast. Nothing happened when he tapped, and he tapped again. Then the door shook ever so slightly. Then it opened, and Nurse Deacon's face looked out. Jim loved Nurse Deacon entirely. She gave him a rusk sometimes. It was pleasant to meet her face first. She smiled and stood back, and Jim went in. He stood there on the threshold, suddenly petrified. There was a solemnity, and there was a curious smell, too, for which he was not prepared. The room looked, too, frightfully white in the reflected light from outside. Then he saw a face on the pillows, with a white cap over it, and the face did not appear to him to be Cousin Neville's at all. "Jim?" said a very odd voice, very low. Ah, it was Cousin Neville all right then. He had really not been quite sure till he heard that, but it was a whisper, which he had heard before, in games. He went forward with the nurse's hand on his shoulder. "Good morning, old man. I hope you're quite well. That's you, isn't it?" "Good morning, Cousin Neville. May I kiss you?" "Kiss him very gently," said Nurse Deacon's voice. Jim approached the bed resolutely, and put a knee upon the edge. The nurse's hand held him, that he should not slip. Then Jim administered a careful kiss to Cousin Neville's left cheek. It felt funny to his lips. "That's all right," said Cousin Neville. "Now sit down, old man, and don't shake the bed." The big eyes turned to Nurse Deacon and seemed to give some sort of signal. The nurse said nothing and passed round the foot of the bed. Jim's eyes followed her a little anxiously, and she went through the door into the bathroom on the further side. But she did not absolutely shut the door, as he had feared she might. "Jim, old man, you're not frightened?" Jim brought his eyes back again to the rather grim face, and determined that he must not be frightened. He cleared his throat, which appeared to have him rather dry. "No, Cousin Neville, not at all, thank you." "Jim, there are just 3 things I want to say. Listen, won't you? And tell me if you don't understand." "All right," said Jim. "The first is this. Do you remember about the Grail?" "Yes, Cousin Neville." He felt he must be very polite, somehow. Well, you were right and I was wrong. It isn't in the woods. At least not more than anywhere else. We needn't go and look for it. It's anywhere where we are. Jim's eyes wandered vaguely around the room. He did not understand one word. You've got it already, said Cousin Neville. Don't lose it, will you? I don't understand at all, Cousin Neville. Cousin Neville did not appear to take this in, for he immediately went on. He simply did not seem to hear. His eyes looked very far away and bright. You don't really find it till you drink it, you know. You must tilt it right up when the time comes, and drink it all. Then you see it. Jim cleared his throat rather more loudly. Cousin Neville seemed to him rather foolish. He raised his voice a little. I don't understand, you know, he said. Cousin Neville's eyes blinked a little. Then he smiled. Poor old man. No, I know you don't. It doesn't matter. Now, number 2. What's number 2? Oh, yes. I'm going to die, you know, and then all this place will belong to you and your mother. This was more intelligible. All of it? Asked Jim. Yes, all of it. Every single thing. And when you're 21, it'll all be yours. You'll be a good boy, won't you? Jim sighed. He had not expected this sort of conversation. And you'll always be good to your mother, won't you? Yes, Cousin Neville. Cousin Neville was obviously ill and must be humored. You'll be Sir Jim, you know. This did not seem interesting. Shall I? Said Jim. Now, do you want to say anything to me? Because number 3 is goodbye. Jim considered. When are you going to die, Cousin Neville? Very soon now. Oh! When you're dead, may I bring Jill in the house again? A glimmer passed over that gaunt face that was like a bad mask of Cousin Neville, and his lips twitched as if he were trying not to smile. Of course, old man. Bring her into the house at once, if your mother will let you. Tell her it's my house just now. If she says no, and then see what she says. Anything else, old man? Shall you be buried in the brick room in the churchyard, Cousin Neville? Inquired Jim, who saw that he was expected to make conversation and really could not think of anything else. Yes, old man. In the brick room, that's right. May I go down and look when it's opened? Better not do that, old man. And you'll say a prayer for my soul, won't you? Oh, yes, said Jim indifferently. There was a pause. Well, old man, I think we'd better have number 3 now. Just press that button behind my head. Jim found an interesting sort of handle attached to a string laying on the pillow. He had not seen anything quite like that before, and examined it with interest. The white thing, Cousin Neville? Yes, that's it. Press it right in. Jim pressed it, and there followed a faint ringing sound from somewhere else. Then the door of the bathroom opened and Nurse Deacon appeared. Now, say goodbye, Jim, and give me a kiss. A curious change had passed over Cousin Neville's face. His eyebrows seemed flickering up and down, and his mouth was very tight. He was breathing rather quickly, too, through his nose. Nurse Deacon, for once, appeared slightly agitated, too. She came round the bed very swiftly. Lift him up, please, said Cousin Neville in a sharp whisper. Once more, then, Jim planted a knee on the bedclothes and administered a kiss. Cousin Neville's cheek seemed even funnier than before. It was all wet and rather cold. "There," said Nurse Deacon in a rather quick voice. "Now go and tell your mother I want her at once." "Goodbye, Cousin Neville," observed Jim. "Bye, old man," came the whisper from the bed.